everyone, and welcome to another episode of Queer Opera Conversations. This informal video series chats with LGBTQIA artists and allies about how we can all make the world a little bit better through opera. My name is Chuck Dillard, artistic director and founder of Queer Opera, and today I am very happy to reconnect with two friends of mine, Chris Herbert and Tim Long. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. So as always, I tell our viewers just a little bit about you so they know who you are and why I'm talking to you today. Chris is a multiple award-winning and two-time Grammy-nominated baritone who is sought after and successful in every genre of vocal music, opera, oratorio, and art song, from Baroque and before to modern and beyond. He has a few degrees from lesser-known schools like Yale, Harvard, and Juilliard, and is currently the head of vocal studies at William Patterson University in Wayne, New Jersey. And his husband, Tim Long, is pianist and conductor of Muskogee Creek and Choctaw Descent, who is music director of the opera program at Eastman, which I had mentioned to them in an earlier email is one of my favorite initial bio sentences that I've ever read. He has served as assistant conductor for New York City Opera and Brooklyn Phil, and his range as a collaborative musician, conductor, concerto soloist, and recording artist has covered most major stages and major artists in the industry. And these two split their time between Brooklyn and New York with their sweet dog, Pumpkin, who I believe is a beagle. Is that right?
Well, she's a Basset Hound mix with about different breeds. And
okay.
She's 10 years old, overweight, and super friendly. And
as are we all, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
She's at my feet right now, and I'm trying to prevent her from whining.
No problem. So how has Pumpkin adjusted to having the two of you home all day, every day, for months on end?
She loves it. She just, she hates it when we talk on Zoom.
Yes, I understand.
Zoom.
Yes, my two are with my husband and his parents, so just so I can have some peace and quiet, because otherwise they would be right here, front and center. Great, so that's just a very brief bio that does not do service to these two artists, but I just want to give our listeners an overview. So let's jump into some questions that are not necessarily queer in nature. And Tim, I want to start with you. As I mentioned earlier, you do have Native American heritage, and I want to know about your beginnings in classical music coming from an Indigenous heritage. Is that different than a non-Indigenous heritage?
Well, I only know the Indigenous heritage, so it's really hard to on that. But strangely enough, all of my classical music did come from being Indigenous. I'm half Muskogee Creek and half Choctaw, and I'm a member of the Thopoko tribal town, which is sort of one of the original Creek confederacies. And I grew up in the Southern Creek Nation. The way I came to music was that my mother grew up in an Indian orphanage down in southeastern Oklahoma. And then she had terrible luck when she was in high school. She caught tuberculosis. So she ended up in quarantine for a total of 5 years in an Indian sanatorium where they had tribes from all over the country. And this was at the time that they did experimental treatments on them as well, so they could prepare for the general population. But she said everybody listened to country and Western music. She got sick of the twang and found a classical radio station. So when my sister and I were born, she only played recordings of Beethoven's music. So I grew up from when I was a baby hearing Wilhelm Kempff and Alfred Brendel playing Beethoven, and I actually didn't hear any other music apart from Beethoven until I started playing piano myself and started playing other composers. But yeah, then I initially saw my first live piano at this Creek church that we went to. My grandfather was a minister. So I would watch she was actually a relative who became my babysitter, who was also the pianist at the church. So I would watch her playing, and then I got a toy piano at 3 and began playing on my own. Then I started lessons at 5, and I was my teacher's first student. She was 15, and I praise her to this day because she didn't know what to do. So she started me on theory at age 5. And I
Wow.
had a theory coloring book and just sort of went from there.
Amazing. In the Black Lives Matter and Trans Lives Matter, I don't know why we're not making more noise about Indigenous people. It is amazing to me the contribution um, to the culture of this country, and there just doesn't seem to be enough um, focus put on that.
That's because it's the original sin
Right.
of this country. The very first thing that this country was basically founded by looting and stealing from others, and it completely goes against our modern idea of American exceptionalism, which is a fraud, frankly. But until we get through Black Lives Matter and other rights, I think we're going to be the last ones to achieve equality, because we've had presidents, starting with Andrew Jackson, who wanted to decimate us. I mean, there are letters that they were wanting to eradicate us from the face of this earth, and we still have him on the $20 bill. So it's very present, and you know how far behind we are because we're the only ethnic group, that oppressed ethnic group, that has sports teams named after them everywhere, including in our nation's capital, where it's called the Redskins. And you have the Buffalo Blackskins, the Chattanooga Chinese, or I don't know, what else would there be?
Yeah.
You don't have any of that, but nobody has a problem with Native Americans because we're so desensitized to it.
Yeah. This could be a whole nother conversation, and thank you, first of all, for making this forefront in the conversation today. I wanted to really lean into that, and I'm sure we're going to come back to it because there were some other things I wanted to talk to you about. But just for now, let's throw a question over to Chris about how you juggle everything that you do. You have such a prolific and impressive career already at such an early age, and part of that is your involvement with New York Polyphony, which is what I believe to be your Grammy nominees. Is that right? Yeah. So how do you juggle being a recitalist, being a professional ensemble member, and being a university faculty member? How does that work for you?
I mean, you make it work. You carve out your schedule. Being in an ensemble that tours, you have to be in agreement with the other people in the ensemble about when the touring periods are. So there's just a lot of planning, a lot of juggling. There's no science to it. There's no magic to it. It's just literally keeping track of your schedule and then knowing what to say yes to and what to say no to.
Right. I think you may be downplaying your exceptional organizational skills. Because
proactive.
Yes. What I really try to teach my students is time management, and I think what you're talking about is time management to the 10th degree, because that takes some significant work on your part, on everyone's part that you're involved in, and you have to be planning not months but years in the future to make sure everything works out. I imagine.
Yeah, you do. I mean, we are. I will say this: we're fortunate not to have children, so we don't have to deal with a lot of the pressures of family life in terms of being there for other people other than ourselves. So
Right.
I think that we've sacrificed a lot for our careers, and being in COVID, it's been a completely different situation because we've been together since March, and that's been really wonderful.
Right.
And it's given us a chance to kind of reset. But yeah, time management is a challenge for everybody, and I've always been pretty good at it, but that's just because I learned how to write things down early on. It's mind-boggling to me that there many people I know and respect and love who don't keep a schedule, and my brain would go crazy if I didn't write things down.
We also have schedules, so we do 6 months at a time, so we know exactly when and where we're going to see each other.
Yeah.
And for my first year here in Rochester, it was also scheduled for Pumpkin because we had to decide where she was going to be. But,
Right.
That all helps a lot. Yeah.
And I think that's really important, as a couple, that you have to put time for yourselves in the schedule as well,
Mhm.
not just professional engagements, but personal time. Because you are both working in sort of different directions in different areas, you have to make that time, or else you'll never find it otherwise.
Truth.
Yeah. So Tim, let's go back to you. One of the things in your bio that I wanted to know more about, and I know that our listeners would, is this opera Missing. It is not something, or not a piece that I am familiar with. Can you talk a little bit more about its origins, its plot, and maybe what its future is?
Sure. I came up to this piece about 3 years ago. Pacific Opera Victoria was part of the commission with City Opera Vancouver to do an opera with a libretto by this great genius, I think. She's a filmmaker and writer named Marie Clements, and she is Métis and Dene from Galiano Island, which is between Vancouver and Vancouver Island.
Mm.
I can't say enough about her. You meet Marie and talk to her. She just seems like a normal person, and then you see the work that she does, and it's just out of this world tremendous. I don't know how a human does that. So they approached Marie first, and then they found this wonderful composer from Toronto called Brian Current, and they wrote a piece. It's about the now 4,000 missing Indigenous women in Canada that have gone basically unnoticed, because there is a lot of racism in Canada, not as much as there is in the United States. At least they are starting to do things up there, including land recognition before major events, which I would like to get started here as well. So this opera, uh, it's about a girl, a white girl who has a wreck north of Vancouver, and she is rescued by the authorities. But as she's being rescued, she sees an Indigenous girl in the ditch who is not rescued and who dies, and they sort of take on dual roles in how they see the world. About 15% of the opera is in Gitxsan and the rest is in English. And Gitxsan is one of the tribes right around Vancouver. And it's incredible because you go to this duet and they're sharing this newborn child, which is really the child of both of them. And the duet is in English and Gitxsan. And it's the most beautiful, beautiful. I'm going to cry just thinking about it. It's sort of weird. I think we did a brilliant job with it. And for me, it was like a birthright. I hear about Jewish birthrights and going to Israel and spending every day for a summer investigating your roots. Well, this did that for me. I met so many Indigenous people, so many tribes, because we would always have a blessing by a local elder, and we would always end with optional smudging so that people didn't leave with all of that energy from the story going with them, because we reached out to a lot of the families of victims. So we would always have a private performance before the opening where we would invite families and the local Indigenous people, and you would hear sobbing throughout the piece. It was so powerful and such an important piece. And I'm thrilled that finally, at my advancing age, I'm able to sort of combine both of my worlds, you know?
Absolutely. So were there plans for future performances before COVID hit?
Well, there are plans in the future. You know, we did the world premiere in Vancouver, and then we did performances in Victoria as well. Just last fall, we did a tour. So we performed in Victoria, then Regina, then Prince George. And Prince George is further north in British Columbia. And the reason we were there is because that is the end of the Highway of Tears, where a lot of these crimes happened. And there are still stories up there about truckers swerving in order to hit Indigenous women on the side of the highway because they know that there won't be investigations. So even now, yeah,
Wow.
it's pretty terrible. So it's great to be able to throw focus on this to people in the music world.
Absolutely. Um, excuse me, one of the things that struck me that I didn't know is the use of the native language in the opera. And that reminds me of when I was in Victoria. I believe it was either Victoria or Vancouver. The National Museum of British Columbia um, had of an exhibit of it was essentially like a table that had buttons, and each button was a word. Maybe you've seen this. Uh,
We went there together in January of 2019.
yeah, of languages that were evaporating, essentially, not being taught. And I wept just hearing all of these words in these native voices that that we're not going to that we may not hear, 100 years from now. And how amazing would it be to keep writing art songs and operas in these native languages to keep them alive, and to know that they're doing that and missing is fantastic.
Yeah, and it's preserved because a
Yeah.
lot of things are going to be lost, but this is preserved in sound. And we worked with an elder named Vince Gogag, who's wonderful. I mean, it's his first language. So we worked with him. We worked with a PhD student from the University of British Columbia who was specializing in Indigenous languages. So we had IPA and just
Wow.
there with us working.
Fantastic. Cool. Great. Well, I can't wait to see where that goes, and hopefully we'll get some performances down in the States as well um, in the future.
Well,
Uh, yeah. So let's move on to some queer stuff. This is Queer Opera Conversation, so let's dig into that. I'd love to know from both of you, if you can recall, what was the first time you saw a representation of queerness on stage in your art form?
I still remember the first time I saw queerness like represented at all, and that was
Okay.
I was looking at the New York Times. I was in high school and I was looking at the New York Times art section over a weekend. I remember there was like a movie about two gay characters, and I was like, "Oh my God, that exists!" And this was the '90s.
Yeah.
Um, and then, gee, you sent those questions, and I can't think of the first time that I saw queerness in opera other than I was in it. I did a scene at Aspen Music Festival of the final scene from Popea, and I was Nerone, and I had to kill Popea, and that was the way the director decided we would end the scene. And then I made out with the servants who were men and women.
Okay.
So that was the first time for me.
Okay.
I honestly can't remember for myself. I grew up in southeastern Oklahoma in the 70s and early 80s, and that was not, well, I would say being gay was not the most positive thing there. So you sort of learn to hide,
Right.
And so my first memories are, I was at Oklahoma City University where I went to my undergrad school. It was a wonderful school. And there were so many gay people there. And it
Mm-hmm.
kind of frightened me because I wasn't out yet. But I clearly remember a lot of gay cast members. And I played violin in the orchestra, and I played my first opera, which was Dido and Aeneas. And it seems like all the men were gay in that. So I do remember that. And I fell in love with opera just by playing that small Purcell opera. And other than that, I'm not sure that I remember specific queer influences in opera because it's so pervasive, frankly.
Right. That it's very accepting and inclusive in
Yeah,
terms of the personnel that are involved.
yes, and sort of
Right.
being outward and extroverted is common and almost expected. So people tend to be much more of themselves in the vocal world.
Right. Um, yeah, I did an interview with an artist, Lucia Lucas, a few weeks ago, a very famous trans singer who's in Germany now, and she said she didn't care who she was on stage as long as she could be herself off stage,
Mm-hmm.
which I thought was very interesting. Um, what I try to do with queer opera is bring that queerness sort of forefront in the storylines through like swapping genders of some of the roles, but we can talk about that a little bit later. I don't normally share my own stories, but I wanted to mention, because this specifically deals with you, Chris, that my first queer experience on stage was our concert in New York with Scott Mello.
Right, exactly. Gay American music.
Exactly, yeah. And it was almost, I don't want to say distasteful, but almost frightening for me, because I was not used to putting myself, and I mean, I was the pianist. I was not facing the audience or saying words like you guys were, but I was not used to that part of myself being presented to a group of people. That was a very fearful thing for me to do growing up in South Carolina. And so that was the very first time that I thought, this is possible and people can actually accept this and not be disgusted and by it. And it was that was, I will say, Chris, that was a turning point for me, and it's one of the things that inspired me to do queer opera, because I knew that if I was in a safe place, that I could do this. And my purpose then was to create more safe places around the country. So thank you for being part of that.
Well, thank you for being part of that. It's funny, you do an artistic project and you wonder if it has any impact, and I guess it did. So
if we had not done that together, it's very possible that queer opera would not have had the impulse to be created. So there you go.
Buried deep on YouTube, there's you and me performing on that concert. It's like almost in the dark web.
No, I've seen it. It has that like RuPaul season 1 filter on it. It's
I think
right?
it was like an ancient camcorder.
Yes. The Matthew Shepard song, I think. I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, it's I can't remember the name of it either.
Yeah. Anyway, cool. So Chris, another question specifically for you. As a gay man, what are your thoughts about portraying straight roles in opera? I talk about this a lot with my students. What is acting? What is authenticity? Do you even what is that process for you when you're asked to play a straight romantic role on stage? Is that simply acting for you? Does that feel a little bit icky and sort of go against your whatever?
I mean, I've only ever played straight roles on stage.
Of course.
I think.
As one.
Oh no, I was an As One. Laura, I was did all the initial readings for As One.
Oh wow.
Kaminsky's, and for there I was trans. But I mean, although it was like the whole conceit of that show is that there's a before and after.
Right.
It's problematic, but the before, I was the before, and so I was pretty much trying to play straight.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really an issue for me. Like, for example, the it's not something I really think about.
Okay.
For example, I did the premiere of Hannah Lash's Desire in October this past year, and in that one I play a kind of jealous and uncreative husband for a wife who's the main character. This is Pumpkin.
Oh my gosh.
She's jealous.
She's adorable.
And that one, no, I mean, no, it's not really you're acting. So it's like you said from before. I can, as long as I can be whoever I want off stage, I'm happy to do whatever on stage, as long as I'm not playing like a Nazi or something.
Right.
Also, I mean, he had a very different experience than I think you in South Carolina and I in Oklahoma had.
Yeah.
It was a non-issue where he grew up.
Yeah, it wasn't as much of an issue. Yeah, I grew up in the New York area, and while you still deal with family baggage and your own baggage, the general idea in society, at least in the late 90s, early aughts, is like, if you're gay, you're gay.
Right. Right. And where Tim and I grew up, you know, who we were was not okay, and we had to work against that the whole time.
Right.
And when you're dealing with artistic expression, that is a huge barrier to be bumping up against in your formative years.
Absolutely, because you're always hiding.
Right.
And how
Right.
can you ever communicate honestly, even through sound, if you're hiding a major part of yourself, or if you're conflicted about a major part of yourself?
Right. And for me as a pianist, it I didn't have to look at the audience. I didn't have to say words. You know, I could be thinking whatever I wanted, but these young singers who have to face a group of people and sing about love and heartbreak, I mean, that is just another level altogether if you are also being told that who you love is not okay.
Yeah, I see what you mean there for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's amazing that we have operas like Angels in America now.
Yeah.
You know, here it is becoming a really big part of the social fabric, an important part.
Right. Right.
Of course.
Yeah.
So, Tim, here's a question for you. Uh, and I'll give you a little bit of a setup. So, part of queer opera is casting roles not based on gender or voice type, but based on identity. And so, we did a Traviata scene with two females. We did the Act 4 or the Act 3 quartet in the Bohème with 4 females. The Romeo and Juliet initial meeting scene with 2 guys. Do you see this gender fluidity to be blasphemous or disrespectful to the art form, especially with smaller regional companies, local companies? And this is a loaded question because I'm doing it, and here I'm asking you if it's okay. But I've always seen music as plastic. It's not rocket science. No one's going to get hurt. What are your thoughts about the flexibility in music, specifically with opera casting?
Well, here's the deal. I mean, and this is something opera's dealt with probably since its inception. Many opera fans and many opera benefactors are conservative traditionalists, and they want to see the same traditional operas and stagings done over and over and over.
Bring a book.
Well, exactly. I mean, we have plenty of this, especially now in the days of video. We can always access a beautiful traditional production, but not all companies can do those well because it takes money to do it. I don't really, I'm not your usual opera conductor in that I wouldn't call myself an opera queen. I love opera. I love doing opera. I love opera singers. I love creating. And I'm like you. I find it to be, for it to survive, it needs to be plastic.
Yeah.
And we need to be experimenting with things because we see it through a different lens. We see it through somebody's different history and perspective, and we learn more about the piece through that. And therefore, the piece evolves into the 21st century. I think there's nothing worse than leaving the perspective in the 18th century and just leaving it at that because we don't learn anything new from it.
Right. And here's a question for both of you guys. In this age of COVID and then coming out of COVID, whenever that will be, does opera need to be different moving forward in order to re-engage with the public?
It needs to be a hell of a lot cheaper for people who want to see it, and also for the production side of it. It's such an expensive art form. I mean, I really don't understand how it could last unless it changes, like from an economic perspective. But you're asking more about programmatically, does it need to be different?
I mean, I guess in every way. I mean, opera companies, I know I talk to a lot of small opera directors about what kind of content can we present virtually. Most of it is being presented for free. We're trying to be as inventive as we can, but you know, it's only at a we're limited with, you know, technology and what we have at home and audio and this and that. And I'm concerned that we will not, that the status quo is just out the window. Like it needs to reinvent itself programmatically, repertoire-wise, what types of rooms it's presented in case we can't have, 100 people in an opera hall, or 60 people in a pit, or even a chorus, or even everybody has to be 6 feet apart. I just wonder what opera is going to be like a year, 5 years from now, and if it yeah, that's all. That's just my thought.
First of all, I'd say that the free thing can't last. I
Right.
mean, there are so many individuals, even the most successful people in our field are suffering. They have no income. And they don't have foreseeable income because a lot of companies have canceled into the spring of 21. So that has to be rethought for one thing. But in the past few years, when you look at the smaller progressive companies, they're already doing these things that you're talking about. You look at the industry in LA, and they did something. What was it called? Oh my gosh, I just forgot the name of it. It got a lot of attention because it was actually staged in cars. So
Oh,
people
wow.
get rides in cars with a character who would sing, and they would go on to a different car. They had talked to me about participating in an opera last year, and I couldn't do it schedule-wise, but it was outdoors, and it was about land. It was called Sweet Land, about occupation and how you treat land and all that. And I'm on some grant panels for different things, and so I see a lot of new operas coming out, and they are experimenting with location quite a bit, which is sort of what you're talking about.
Right.
They're opening up. A lot of people are doing things in non-classical spaces, in non-operatic spaces. They're reorchestrating things so that they don't have to have a full pit. So that is already in motion. It's just a matter of if the more traditional people embrace that or not.
Right. Chris, years ago, gosh, you originated this performance of Venturiza in Central Park. Is that like 10 years ago now?
It was 2012, I think. So 8 years ago, yeah.
8 years ago? Yeah. So I don't know if there's a video or anything.
Yeah, if you go to my YouTube channel, it's still the trailer on the channel. I made a promo about it. But the idea is that we call it Winterize, play on words there. But it's Winterize that performed outdoors. Tim played all of the accompaniment into a 4-octave Casio keyboard.
No.
And
4 octaves, the keys were not traditional piano size, and there was no pedal.
No.
What? Why did you do that?
It was
because of love.
Yeah. And then my friend Jonathan Zalman, he took all of the Casio keyboard tracks and then soundscaped them, so it's not just piano. So it's like multi electronic sounds. And then what we do is we use the same technology that you have in a drive-through theater, where there's a radio antenna that's taking over a local radio frequency, and we pump the music through that, and then people with their personal radios tune into that frequency, and the audience becomes the accompaniment while I sing.
Right.
Go from place to place to place. So I did it at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden several years in a row, and then I've done it at a few other places, Annapolis, upstate New York.
Yeah. So I only brought that up because I thought a project like that is the perfect project for the future of performance in, COVID, post-COVID, I think, because you could do that self-distancing. You could do it outdoors in a safe space, and that would be amazing. I would be interested in talking to you guys about maybe franchising that, for another for another baritone. And I'm also thinking, Tim, how the hell did you play Estrarung on a 4-octave? You just do it.
Left hand or vice versa.
Try Lindenbaum.
Or Lindenbaum. Oh, God.
Long key size. It was very difficult. I had to do a pass through the whole thing, and then I would add an octave. Well, Jonathan would add the octave, and I would play things, or he would add the pedal, and then I would have to play along with this the computer that had recorded my previous take,
Wow.
and it showed every irregularity in my rhythm. So suddenly you're seeing every tiny fluctuation spelled out on a computer, and you feel so imperfect, and yet you're trying to play with that imperfection.
Thank you again.
Wow. Labor of love for sure. Yeah. Well, I want to thank you both for your time, and I want to wrap up with just one more question. These conversations I like to gear towards singers that are off or that are at their jumping off point, which I think is a terrible phrase, but it is used quite a bit. And I'm curious to know what either of you might say to a 25-year-old singer who has just gotten their master's, just looking to begin a professional career, maybe specifically a queer singer or an Indigenous singer, that may be able to use their depth of knowledge, their personal journey, in one way or another moving forward in their career. How might you advise such a singer?
Do you want to go first? No. I have two things to say.
Yep.
One is there's no one way to do it. So this idea that you have to go to graduate school and get a master's degree, and then you have to go to a young artist program, and then you have to go to Germany, and then you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to sing standard opera. That sounds really boring to me, but it is what I thought I had to do. You don't have to do it. And the other one is, even though we're in the era of Me Too, and we're in the era of Black Lives Matter, and we're in the era of all these social justice movements, there are still going to be lots of people who might try to take advantage of you, and there are going to be people that are lecherous or gross, and that is something you're going to have to deal with. So be ready and approach it from a position of integrity.
To follow up on that, is how would one gain the skills to be able to defend themselves, for lack of a better word, to stand up for oneself? Obviously, singers come in all shapes and forms, to being incredibly trusting, to being incredibly jaded and defensive. But what are what's a good way to say this? How does someone learn how to do that to protect themselves in the industry?
Figure out who you can trust, who's a mentor, and they can advocate for you ideally.
Right.
I didn't have that in young artist programs, and I remember being in some pretty compromising situations because I thought this is what you're supposed to do.
Right.
And it was uncomfortable, but at the same time I thought, oh, this is just the business. And now after Me Too, I realized, oh, that was a fucked up situation I was in. Sorry, I said fuck.
Well, it's true, but it's been the industry for so long.
Yeah.
It's been an accepted part of the industry.
Yeah.
And I think everyone who is aspiring learned to be subservient and to keep their mouths shut because they want work. And luckily that's changing a bit. But the other thing that I think is very important, and we're trying to make changes at Eastman, and this is one that I think is very important, is that whether it's about race or about being queer, a lot of us don't have practice in speaking about it. So I know for myself, when I was affronted when I was younger, I was in such shock that I really didn't know how to form words. I didn't know how to speak about it or defend myself, and I would just get really emotional. I think it's really important that we practice speaking about race, that we practice speaking about being queer, so that we don't have our emotions take over when somebody doesn't agree with us, but we can speak confidently and intelligently about it and let them go off the rails.
Right. I think that's brilliant. Absolutely. And something that I think also affects that is just the generations that are in our universities right now. We have our 60-year-old tenured professors, we have our 40-year-old assistant professors and lecturers and instructors, and we have our 20-year-old students. And though it feels like those three generations are more different than they were 10 or 20 years ago. And so the 40-year-olds are learning and are trying to be more compassionate. I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but some of the 60-year-olds are more traditional in their ways and how they communicate, specifically speaking about race, about being taken advantage of, about queerness. And then the 20-year-olds, at least in Portland, just say whatever they want, whenever they want. You know, there's very little filter, which is a wonderful thing. They have no fear. But I think 10, 15 years from now, when the 40-year-olds are the tenured professor, senior faculty, it'll be a very different environment, and I hope much more friendly for students coming in.
I hope so, but then, you know, society will have changed then as well. And I think
True.
all of us as we get older is that we get stuck in our ways without re-examining our own values. And that's so important always, but especially right now. And
Look at America.
Yeah, exactly. But I tell you, I adore my students. I absolutely love my students. They're so smart and hardworking. And I try to instill in them a confidence in how they look at a score and how they examine and make choices. But one of my favorite things when I did my final interview at Eastman, we had a 1-hour session where it was just students and me, and they could ask anything they wanted. And one person, and apparently she asked this of all the finalists, Jillian, she asked, so what are your thoughts on basically, I don't know, casting and minorities and all of this? And I just took a second and I said, well, I'm a gay Native American. So if I weren't for that, you know, I'd be really kind of a self-hating gay Native American. So I'm all for, you know, different races and different genders and experimentation with all of that. But I want my students, you know, who knows with careers? Nobody can predict a career, but I want them to be confident people who are also compassionate and not afraid to speak about their opinions.
Absolutely.
That's why it's great what you're doing, Chuck.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you. I'm trying. I can't wait to be back in a room with singers again, and not because I want to have influence over them, but just to commune with them and hear their voices, their singing voices, and their speaking, you know, their thoughts and fears, and work together. This, you know, we're doing the best that we can, but nothing replaces a good old opera rehearsal, and
Oh my God,
nothing.
be in the room, it's just incredible. And I tell you, we were 3 weeks away from opening Sweeney Todd with 2 tremendous casts, a tremendous chorus. I was about to start orchestra, and you know, I've been around a bit. I've had a lot of shows. I wanted to do it, but I was heartbroken for my students, and I especially just miss, like you say, being in the room with them.
Yeah, we were 1 week away from staging for Merry Wives of Windsor, and I was just about to do the final music run when we got canceled, and then we've already canceled our fall show. So it's
We've
can't think.
postponed our Orpheus and Underworld twice now, so it'll take place in 2021.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, I want to end there and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Chuck.
This reconnection is long overdue, and I hope we are able to keep our energies flowing together in the future. So just officially thanking Chris Herbert and Tim Long for their time with me today. I also want to thank Bonnie Miksch and Dean Leroy Bynum at Portland State University. They support queer opera in so many ways, as also the PSU Foundation. So again, gentlemen, thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you both again soon.
Thank you, you too.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.